third part, the controls, right? So what have we done so far? What we have done so far is we figured out why protecting information is important, right? How this is becoming an unmanageable problem. Then we figured out what the process of managing your information security is by first identifying what you have, by classifying information, then putting controls. We figured out what different pieces of information you have. We have also figured out what the dimensions of security are and what the levels are. And finally, we went through the process of classifying it by following the spreadsheet, which is a template that you will use. Now for the last major chunk. You know what your information is. You know how to classify it. How do you pick out the controls? That's the last major chunk. Once you have the controls, your information is protected, and so on and so forth. So the question is, so what is a control? And what's the purpose of a control? The idea of a control is to be able to minimize the risks to a manageable level, right? This is something you need to remember, that in no way can you have perfect security. The idea of controls is not to prevent anything from happening. Things are still going to happen, but to reduce their probability, to reduce their loss potential to such a level that you can manage it and you will not go bankrupt, or you will not destroy your business based on that. So it's kind of an economic decision as to how much money you would invest in controls and what you would invest in. So that's what controls is. If you look at the controls, it has several purposes to it. One is deter, protect, detect, respond, and recover from it. So these are the different 5 elements of that. The reason we're going to do an example of a house, and then I'm going to compare that to what happens in the information technology world to compare how we have different kinds of controls. And then I'll go through and explain the process that we have set up for you guys to figure out the controls. So if you look at the deterrents, what are the different deterrent measures that you use for protecting your own personal houses? The ADT sign, that's one thing, right? Having a dog, that's another one. That's a deterrence. People don't even come. You may or may not have ADT, but if you just stick a sign in your yard says ADT protected, a lot of people are not going to come. You may or may not have a dog. You just have a tape recorder, record player just barking every now and then. That'll deter some people from entering. The third thing is some people have the automatic light switches, which switches on and off in different rooms when they're traveling. That's a part of the deterrence because if people know that somebody's in the home, they're not going to come. So that's your first level. What is the corresponding control for information security in organizations? What are the deterrent controls that we use? How many of your IT staff here? Very few. So what kind of controls we have corresponding to this? What will prevent people from actually doing this? Right, absolutely. The policies with repercussion that, look, if you do this, you will get fired. The second thing is that, look, we are monitoring all of your email. You may or may not monitor it because half the people are not going to do it, right? If you say that you know precisely what you're doing, you can monitor what you're doing on a computer. People are not going to go to gambling sites. People are not going to go to pornography sites because they fear. So that's a deterrent. By saying that you are going to do it, it will prevent people from doing this. So let's go to the next level. That's the deterrent, which prevent people from doing. The second thing is protection. Now, how do you protect your house? Locking is one of them. How else do you protect it? Say it again. Oh. Let's not get there. I'm a non-violent person here. Right. If you look at an alarm system, it can be construed as protection, but it typically is more of a detection system, that if somebody comes in, that's a detection system. So how else do you protect? By having your iron bars on your windows, like they do it in New York City in some areas. You can't have glass windows. Somebody's going to break in and come in. You have to have the iron grills on windows and so on and so forth. So there are several different ways in which you do protect, right? So what is the same protection mechanism in Encrypting the data could be one of them, right? What else? The firewall, right? You create a firewall so that people can't penetrate into that. Passwords, which people can't break. So those are your protection mechanisms, right? Let's go on to detection. How do you do detection? Cameras installed, that could be one of them. ADT, that's a detection. If somebody breaks in, the third way is you come in and your locks are broken and everything is strewn around. You are the detector in that case, right? So there are different detection mechanisms. What is the equivalent in the IT world? Intrusion detection system is one of them. The second thing could be a log analysis. You basically look at logs constantly, periodically review the logs to see if there is some activity which is going on which should not have gone on, right? That was second way of doing that. And the third way of doing that would be basically you periodically do an audit. That is the third way of detecting if there is some fraud going on or something else. So there are several detection mechanisms. So you come in and you see a break-in in your house. So how do you respond? Huh?
Call police.
You run out of the house, oh my God, call all the neighbors, get a ruckus there. Well, mainly you call the police, you basically go into safer surroundings, you make sure that you're safe. And what do you do in the IT world for that? Say that again? Right, you basically do forensics analysis to see what's going on, right? The second thing which you do is, and if you find any issues with that, then you basically protect your systems better. You change your passwords. You sometimes have to, re-image your machines, change your firewall, change the settings on the firewall, update the rules on the firewall. So that's how you respond. And final thing is recovery. And recovery is in your house. If something happens, you call your insurance company, you buy new stuff, you change the locks, and so on and so forth. That's your recovery. And what's the equivalent in the IT world? Exactly. The most important part of your recovery is to update your security protocols, make sure that this does not happen again. That's a part of your recovery. And also updating whatever you have lost in the incident. So again, so you understand where the controls are coming from. You do controls all the time. This IT world is the new world. Again, the same kind of controls, the same motivations, preventing people from entering, blocking people from entering, and if they do enter, find out what's going on, respond to it, and then finally recover from anything that happened and protect yourself better for future. The same thing happens here. So think of it in this context when you think of controls. So what we're trying to do is, it's just like your household protection, you're protecting your IT world in the organization. Okay. So what are you trying to do is, clearly remember that you did a risk analysis to figure out what can you lose if information is breached, whether it's confidentiality, integrity, or availability. What you're doing in controls is, it's a risk mitigation activity. In risk analysis, you find out what can go wrong, how much you can lose. In risk mitigation, how can you protect what you can lose to a manageable level, right? I'll give you an example of how you reduce a risk to a manageable level. Sometimes you get insurance on your car or your home, and you have a deductible, $100, $250, $500. Why is that? You're making a compromise between your ability to withstand the damage and the amount of money you need to invest in insurance. The same thing happens here. You have controls. You only want to have controls to an extent so that you can withstand the damage and somehow optimize it so that you're not spending too much money. At the same time, you're not losing too much money. So it's really the compromise between the two of them. The same thing happens in controls. So what you want to do here is select all of your baseline. What you have here, the way we have created this controls for you here is that it can be a daunting task if you go about finding out each and every individual control. So what we have done for you is we have done a pre-digested risk management plan for you, whereby based on the classification, we have pre-specified the controls that you will need to implement. So you have a baseline set of controls which will be provided to you. What you will need to do is that in case you need controls beyond that, you can supplement them, but at least you have a baseline controls to start with. And that's what we provide you in this controls section. Okay. A lot of the controls you already have should be in place because of your security measures already in place and because of the C6 security policy. But what we'll show you is that based on the classification, what controls you will need and how to figure out the missing controls. So where did we come up with these controls? These controls are not something which we created from scratch. A lot of the controls are mentioned in some of the standards handbooks, like NIST comes out with security handbooks. We have looked at the NIST handbooks. And in addition to that, International Standards Organization, ISO, has a security guideline or a security bulletin, 17799. That's the standard. So we have used these extensively to figure out the controls that you would need to implement. In addition to that, we have looked at periodicals, we have looked at the papers, and we have also consulted with experts and ISOs in figuring out the controls that are required. So it's not something which we have just pulled out. We have basically taken a lot of wisdom from several different sources to get you a set of comprehensive controls. Okay. Like I said, given the 3 dimensions of security and the 3 levels, how many different unique classifications can we have? 27. So what we have done is, for each of those 27 different classifications, we have a corresponding control chart which comprehensively lists the controls that you would need. So selecting the controls is perhaps the easiest part for you guys. You figure out what the classification is, and you have a set of 27 control charts, and you figure out the right control chart based on the classification level, and you have all the controls that you need. So it's as simple as that. But we'll still go through the process, and I'll explain to you where the controls are. Okay. All right. Before I even go there, let me explain to you what that looks like. All right. Your control chart are really an Excel spreadsheet, right? What it has is, it has an index page in the front which lists all different 27 classifications, all right? And corresponding to each of them, hyperlinked to them, is a separate worksheet in your Excel workbook which lists all of the controls that you need. So this is just like a book. You can go through it and figure out all of the controls. So what I'm going to go through is more the mechanics of the controls and how to select controls rather than the controls itself. So let me go directly to the spreadsheet. No, this is not the right one. This is it. So this is what you will see. If you look at the bottom here, you see the rating menu. Can you guys read this rating menu? If you go further down, you see 1 LLL, 2 LLM, and so on and so forth. Each of the separate tabs, they represent a different classification. And corresponding to that classification, you have the tab which lists all of the controls. So how do you get to that? Well, you can just have it. Let's go to one of them. If you look at this index page, you have the page number corresponding to the different classifications. You have a hyperlink, and it describes what classification it is. So let's just click on this and go to low, low, and low. So what do you see here? What you're seeing here is your sample control chart, which is for low confidentiality, low integrity, and low availability. And what it lists is all of the different controls that you would need. The largest column, the middle column, it basically lists what the control is, and the right-hand column tells you why that control is required, whether it's for confidentiality or integrity or availability or for multiple things. The same control can be required for multiple things or multiple dimensions. All right. What you also see is that there are separate subsections in this control chart. What the separate subsections tell you is that this is a suggested role for who should be responsible for those controls. The state entity or the information owner or the information custodian, the user, the information security officer. So what we have tried to do is, we have provided you with all the controls, suggested certain roles for each of the controls as to who should be managing that control or implementing that control, and we have provided you with such a sheet for each and every single classification. Now remember, this is a minimal set of controls. You can add more security controls if you need to. What it also says is, if you need to change the suggested roles, feel free to change the suggested roles. This is not something which we mandate. We just suggest these roles so that it makes it easy for you to start with in assigning the roles to different people or assigning the controls to different people. All right? And to the left of this, you have a column which gives you the glossary reference number. Now what is that? We have a separate document which describes in detail all of these controls. It basically refers to the index number of the specified control into that glossary. So what you have here is, you have a control spreadsheet and a glossary. The control spreadsheet gives you controls for each each different possible classification of information. And the glossary is a reference manual which gives you details of all of these controls. And so what you have here is you have the explanation of the control, which is right in column E. You have why it is needed in column F, confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and what kind of a control rating it is, and the suggested role, and whether it is required or it is optional. When it is an or, it's a required, otherwise it's an optional. And what we've also done is we have segregated the controls based on types, for instance, authorization, backup, storage, and so on and so forth. So there's a list of categorization here. But this is just more for explanation. And a neat feature which if you hit, oh wait a minute, this is pretty neat. If you hit Alt left arrow, it's going to take you back to the original one. Alt left arrow, this is something which I didn't know before. And if you hit Alt left arrow, it will take you back to the original one. So you can keep navigating back and forth. But all of this does not have to do with the content of this. These are just navigation arrows which you guys can figure out. All right? So fundamentally, you need to understand why controls are implemented. Fundamentally, you also need to understand that the controls have been provided for all different 27 possible classifications. The third thing which you must know is that the controls are cumulative. For instance, if you have low, low, and low, if you have a set of controls, for low, medium, and low, the controls are cumulative. We just add a couple more controls. So if you go from low, low, low on to higher, the controls become larger and larger and larger because it's cumulative. They keep adding on, right? For high, 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 you will need to have all of the controls of low, low, and low, plus some additional controls required for the highest classification. Oh, this spreadsheet is available on the website, CSIC website. So all of the information that we have here in this package is also available electronically, which you can go to the CSIC website and obtain. So all the information is publicly available. Okay, so we have looked at the index page, we have looked at the sample control charts, and we've also looked at the glossary. All right, so these are the three components that you need to worry about. And based on the classification of the human resources management form, we had high, moderate, and low. This would be the sample control chart for that. And you will see that, the number of controls has really gone up. The state entity controls are almost a dozen compared to just 3 for the low, low, and low. So as you can see, the number of controls has gone up for confidentiality. All right. So you've done your inventory now, right? You've done your classification. You've figured out the controls that you need. What do you do next? Gap analysis, figuring out what controls you already have and what controls you need to implement. That's the next step in the process, right? So what we've done is we just took portions of this spreadsheet and we basically ticked all the things which were implemented here into green and things which were not implemented we put as red. So what we figured out is we need 4 new controls to implement to comply with this policy. So this is exactly what you will have to do as you go along doing your information classification. You will need to figure out what controls are already there and what controls you need through this gap analysis. And once you figure out what controls you need, what are you going to do? Implement them, of course. It's a simple answer. And if you can implement them, then you have an exemption process by which you can get an exemption from this. There might be some reasons why you don't want to implement it, because you might have a control which is stronger than that, or there might be financial issues why you don't need to implement it, but that reason needs to be justified, as I'll explain as we go along. So this is your exemption form, and you will find that in Appendix A, I believe, where you have an exemption form. When do you need to fill this? So when you do a gap analysis, figure out the controls that you need to implement. If you don't implement any of those controls, you need to get an exemption for those, right? And you basically need to document why you need to, why you can't comply with it, and second, what risks are posed to the organization by not complying with that, all right? And the most important thing is it needs to be approved by the owner, information owner, the manager, right? The ISO, CIO, and the executive management. Why do you need to do that? To cover yourself. Absolutely. That's the primary reason for that. In the end, if something goes wrong, if a breach happens, you can always show this a look. The management approved this because of financial duress, because of whatever reason, we did not implement this. So it's the management's responsibility, not yours. So everything that you don't comply with, just document it, make sure you pass it along the chain of command. So implementing controls is not that hard because, well, okay, now let me not say that. Implementing controls is hard, but figuring out the controls you need to implement is not that hard. Once you know the classification, you know precisely what controls need to be implemented because you have a control chart based on each possible classification of information, right? What you need to do then is do a gap analysis and either implement the missing controls or file for exemption for any control that is missing. That's the entire process of selection of control.